We're going to figure out what's the lever that they need to pull, as well as what's their aptitude, what sport are they in, what can we realistically get away with. And some of them will take machines with them and we'll do blood every day and urine and all kinds of stuff. And some of them, it's a lot lower.
For myself, I'm not, as I mentioned before, I'm not a big fan of devices. I'm trying to wear the wristwatch. I tend to go off feel, which is not, it's not the ideal objective way to gauge things. But part of my reasoning for this is my colleague from the psychology department, Dr. Aaliyah Crum, has done some studies where they've deliberately given people false feedback about their sleep. So told people you didn't sleep very well, or they've told people you slept really well. And performance can be driven in the expected direction based on feedback, independent of how well people slept or didn't sleep. Now, that doesn't mean you can take someone that only slept 2 hours or was up every 30 seconds because of apnea and tell them they slept great and they're going to perform great cognitive tasks. But you can take someone who slept very well, tell them that their recovery quotient wasn't very good, and their output is going to be worse. And that's my concern about a lot of devices out there, not to name specific devices, but it's still unclear to the general public what the specific algorithms are to generate these recovery scores, right? And so many of the things that reportedly track sleep aren't tracking sleep. They're tracking heart rate and breathing, which are correlates of sleep depth, but that's different. And again, I'm not knocking those. I think the sleep trackers, if nothing else, have provided a forum whereby people are very conscious of getting good sleep. It's sort of like knowing the total caloric intake of your food. People go, wow, I'm actually eating a lot more than I thought.
It's calibration.
Or less in some cases, but often the case is that it's more. So I think for the typical person, I'm wondering whether or not, like myself, because I'm not a competitive athlete or certainly not a professional athlete, competitive with myself, I suppose, but no one else. Morning pulse rate I tend to take when on waking. If I wake out of a really stressful dream, I might relax a little bit and then just take my pulse rate, kind of get a range and see if it's spiking for whatever reason. I don't tend to measure grip strength, although I've heard you can just use a classic scale. Old-fashioned scale with the needle, now old-fashioned, or some other more technical device is probably good if there's a low-cost one.
Yeah, they're all low.
And then the carbon dioxide tolerance test. So we haven't really talked about that in specific ways. My understanding of it is it's 4 deep, slow breaths, in through the nose, out through the nose, and then a big inhale, as max exhale, and then time duration of exhale through the nose. And then stopping the stopwatch at the point where lungs are empty, not necessarily as long as one could hold their breath. Did I get that right?
Pretty much.
Okay, and I guess we should credit you and Brian McKenzie.
Those guys.
Yeah,
for sure.
And the folks under Brian's umbrella for really establishing this as a really good metric. When and how can I use the carbon dioxide tolerance test to gauge recovery? Upon waking, post training session?
Yeah.
Would that be a good time?
Number one answer is whatever you do be consistent. So do it under like any good science experiment, do it under the exact same conditions as you can. That generally means somewhere in the morning, because that's when you're probably going to have the most control, most stability going. So yeah, like you would take any HRV or other metric, wake up, get under control, get stabilized, take your metric.
Got it.
Going to be pretty good.
Got it. Sodium bicarb, baking soda. Rumor has it, and data has it, that it can actually be a pretty effective training tool.
Very effective.
Could you explain a little bit about how it works and how one might explore using sodium bicarb to enhance training output in a couple of different contexts?
Yeah. So there's a handful of these ubiquitously effective supplements for performance. Sodium bicarbonate's one of them. And it's a very ingenious idea because it's so simple. Effectively, muscle contraction happens because enzymatic function occurs within a fairly specific pH range, right? So if it gets extremely acidic, it doesn't like it. And so whether you're running through aerobic glycolysis or anaerobic or anything else, all of these things require, even ATP hydrolysis requires ATPase. An enzyme has to do it. Enzymes don't function well outside of this fairly special range. So what happens is generally fatigue, the sensations of fatigue are actually caused by some signal that, hey, we're starting to run out of pH, or we're getting in the wrong range. You're not out of gas usually. You're not too low on oxygen. You're not running low on muscle glycogen yet. You're typically going to see signs or feel signals of fatigue way prior to that, mostly being pH issues. That being said, what if we could regulate pH better? enter bicarbonate, right? So without going too far into metabolism, effectively what happens is this. You take an inhale and you're mostly breathing in oxygen, O2. When you exhale, you're breathing out CO2. So the difference is you've gained a carbon somehow. Well, all of your carbohydrates in your body come in the form of long carbon chains. In fact, that's what a carbohydrate means. It is a one carbon molecule that has one water molecule attached. It's a carbon that has been hydrated. In the case of like glucose, blood sugar, it's a 6 carbon molecule, right? In terms of fat, which are the only two places you're going to get most of your cellular energy, carbohydrates and fat, that is also a big, long block and chain of carbons. So whether you're getting your energy from fat or carbohydrate, you're going to split those atoms. So in other words, you've got 6 carbons attached to each other. And in this part of chemistry, it's exergonic. So when you break that carbon bond, so break one of those carbons off from the other, that's going to release energy. Just like if you had a pencil in here and I snapped it, and you go bang and pop. I broke the bonds that were connecting that graphite to the next piece of graphite, and that released energy because I put energy into the system, etc. Okay. As a result, though, we've now had, say 5 or 6 carbons chained together. We broke one off the end, which is not how it works, but making the point. And now you have one free-floating carbon. You use that energy release to then go make ATP, to then go make your muscles contract. But now you've got carbon floating around. You can associate free-floating carbon with being at a higher acidic level. It's not going to happen. The only way that you're going to go through this process is if your body says, do we have an oxygen molecule available that we can bind this to immediately? Yes, we do. That carbon attaches to that oxygen molecule. You can't just put CO2 in the blood because of what we just talked about. So you're going to bind it through this bicarbonate process. It's going to go through your blood. It's going to go into the lungs. It's going to go back into its carbon dioxide molecule. It's going to go through the alveoli into the lungs, and you're going to exhale. So you went from carbon to this bicarbonate system, back into carbon, exhale. So inhaled O2. Plants go the opposite, by the way. So they're going to breathe in the CO2. They're going to cleave off that carbon, stack those carbons together, and that's how they get larger. In your blood, those 6 carbon chains are called glucose. If we store that in your muscle, we call it glycogen. So we take a bunch of glucose and stack it together. In a plant, we call that starch. That's effectively what it is, right? So you took a bunch of carbon from the atmosphere, stuck it all together, and that's a starch. If you want to do it in the form of fruit, we take that starch like from the ground, you put it up through the tree, go all the way up to the top, put it into the flour, break it up into these big, huge chunks of starch into little forms called fructose or glucose. That's why fruit has fructose in it, and that's why tubers and stuff have starch in them. Basically, starch in an animal is glycogen in us. Okay, all that to say, if that's happening, and we know that a byproduct specifically of anaerobic glycolysis, meaning the breakdown of carbohydrates for fuel, typically in a very fast pace with low oxygen availability, the downside of that equation is acid production. We know that that's a problem because I started the conversation off there intentionally. So what if we could reduce the acid buildup? Now, you know how pH kind of works. I went in kind of double negatives there, right? You don't want too much acid buildup. Then could we prolong and sustain energy in a more effective pace, especially in this anaerobic interval kind of environment? And again, that's important because in those things, failure is not a result of running out of fuel or oxygen. It's a result of fatigue building up way too quickly.
Is that also true for resistance training? There's maybe more of the creatine phosphate system.
That can be an issue. It could simply be an issue of force production. You just don't have enough force to produce. You're not out of energy. You just can't muster enough force. You do enough reps, then it's going to be an issue there. Creatine phosphate would be the big winner, depending. So to come back a little bit to the beginning, and then I'm circling this all together intentionally. All right. Well, the way that we produce energy is going to be in 2 primary categories, anaerobic and aerobic. Aerobic meaning with oxygen, anaerobic meaning without. In terms of muscle contraction, you're pretty much talking about carbohydrates or fat. Now, fat is going to be exclusively aerobic, meaning I'm going to use fat from the entire body, roughly equally. So you're doing a sprint up a hill, and your hamstrings or your glutes or your quads are on fire. You're not just going to use the fat that's directly in those hamstrings. You're going to lose it from the entire body. It has to go through lipolysis, so it's in this stored form in adipose tissue. It's got to get broken down, put into blood. Blood's going to have to go through your body, get taken up into muscle, taken up through muscle into the mitochondria. Then we're going to have to go through this process called beta oxidation. So remember, carbohydrates and glucose especially is a 6-carbon molecule. Fat, if it's in the form of a triglyceride, it is a 3-carbon glycerol backbone and 3, tri 1, 2, 3, fatty acids. 3-carbon backbone, and those fatty acids are just big, long chains of carbon. That's all it is, right? So we're going to break that thing down, put it in the blood, move it up, move it into our mitochondria. You can't walk those things across the mitochondrial wall. They're too big. So what you have to do is cleave them off into little chunks. And it turns out we break them off into 2-carbon chunks. So we call it beta, as in 2. Move those into mitochondria. That can go through this little thing called Krebs cycle or trioxylic acid cycle. And you kick out a bunch of energy out of that. You had 2 carbons. So as a result of that process, you're going to generate 2 carbon dioxides. But remember, you can only go through that process if oxygen is available, because you have to be able to place those carbons onto something, or acid gets up way too high too fast. This is one of the reasons why fat is a nice fuel source, but it's very slow. It takes physical time to move from the back of your shoulder into your blood, down your hamstring, uptake. In addition, it's required oxygen availability. If you need energy faster, you simply don't have the time to bring in the oxygen, transport it through, go through capillaries, exchange through tissue, etc. Carbohydrate, on the other hand, is going to be stored locally in the exercising muscle cell, and specifically in the cytoplasm.
As glycogen.
As glycogen in the stored there. So what's going to happen initially, your initial demands for exercise or for fuel are going to come from the glycogen stored within the muscle fiber itself. It's just going to break right there, and you're going to be off to the races. So you have the 6-carbon molecule, you're going to break it into 2 separate 3-carbon molecules. Okay, boom. That breaking provides you a tiny bit of energy. Very small, but some. Now you're going to take those 2 3-carbon molecules, and you want to be able to oxidize them, because that's your only next step. But in order to do that, you got to go those into mitochondria. So you got to break one of those molecules off. So then you'll be back to your 2-carbon molecule, just like you did with fat. That's going to go into mitochondria, and then it's going to go through the exact same Krebs cycle, 2 carbons, etc. But hold on. If you don't have sufficient oxygen or sufficient mitochondrial availability, and you're stuck at that 2, 3-carbon place, what do? You have problems, right? Now we have to say, okay, wait a minute. We have a 3-carbon molecule, and we have a bunch of this acid buildup. Now, acid functionally is hydrogen. That's what pH, potential hydrogen, is what pH stands for, right? So if hydrogen is building up as a byproduct of muscular contraction, and then you're having this 3-carbon molecule, what it can actually do is grab one of those hydrogens. And those 3-carbon molecules, by the way, are called pyruvate or pyruvic acid, right? If you take a pyruvic acid and you grab a hydrogen, put it on top of it, we now have a different name for it. It's called
hydrogen peroxide.
Lactate. Bingo, right? That's what lactate or lactic acid is, right? So we've now built that up. So number one reason why lactate's not causing your fatigue, it's actually preventing it, and then it does a bunch of other really cool stuff. But the point is, that system can only last so long. That gets overwhelmed very quickly. What are you going to do with the rest of this hydrogen? Well, if you started off in a normal pH range, you don't have very far to go before you've now gone into that level of too much acidity. If you start off in a more basic, and basic I don't mean simple, I mean chemistry, right, and more alkaline, then that same amount of increase in pH is no longer, now just puts you back in your physiological range. So sodium bicarbonate, whether taken as a cream or a powder or baking soda or anything else, can simply put you in a more alkaline state, even acutely. So this is something you can take right now before your workout. You're going to delay what we call delay the progression of fatigue.
And how would people start to approach this practice? My understanding is you can do this with common, store-bought baking soda.
No question.
There's always a concern about gastric distress, that it's a very effective laxative, sometimes an unwanted laxative effect. But how would one approach this before? Let's say I'm doing the mile repeats.
Yep.
Exercise, mile repeats protocol that we talked about earlier. I'm doing that for a few months, and now I want to try the sodium bicarb approach. I'm well hydrated. Hopefully I'm well rested. I'm ready to go. When am I going to drink this sodium bicarb solution? How would I make the solution? Let's say I take 10 ounces of water.
Yeah.
How much sodium bicarb should I put in there? Can we come up with it? Is it half a teaspoon? Is it a teaspoon?
Here's how I'm going to tell you. You will thank me by starting lower. You can always go more later.
So a little pinch.
You cannot go backwards.
How about I start with a 1/4 teaspoon?
Fine. Honestly, half is fine.
Half a teaspoon.
It's totally fine.
Dissolve that. Slug that down.
Yep.
I read a study recently that showed that people will hit their the peak benefits of this at different times, but it's somewhere, if memory serves me correctly, somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes later. So I might want to drink it on the way to the track.
It can be as low as 20.
Okay. So maybe as I get to the track, since I'm going to do some warm up with some walk and jogging.
I say 45 minutes.
Okay.
That's just a very rough standard. But yeah, you're right. It is individualized. And you probably want to play with that a little bit. If not, just somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to an hour.
Okay. And then the perceived and real fatigue, if done correctly, the perceived and real fatigue ought to be reduced.
Yes.
I can do more work without feeling exhausted. Will I feel less of a lactate burn?
Yep.
Done in air quotes for those listening. I realize that's a very crude way to describe a complex physiological process.
Yep.
Fantastic. Can sodium bicarb be used repeatedly for longer duration training?
Yep.
And if I were going to use it with weight training for whatever reason, maybe I'm doing circuit type training or I'm doing the superset type strength training that you talked about before, push, pull, where it's a little bit more cardiovascularly demanding.
Yep.
Then maybe I'd sip that throughout the workout, make sure there's a bathroom nearby. It sounds like, because I am aware that many people get pretty serious gastric distress.
It can happen very quickly.
Okay. Great. Well, it sounds like an amazing training tool. I really appreciate you sharing it, because I think it's one that doesn't get a lot of airtime these days because it's been around, but sounds like it has some pretty impressive effects.
Yeah, you know what's sort of funny about that is, I get it, pop culture is what it is, but still to this day, if you want to talk about sort of your most effective general health/performance supplementation, it's the same 3 to 4 to 5. And it's because they work really well.
Without going into the chemistry of each one and the practice of each one, because I definitely want to get you back to talk about diet, nutrition and supplementation at some point. But I think we need a full couple of hours to get that right, at least. If you, as a teaser, would you mind just listing off the other supplements that you have found are very effective for many people? So sodium bicarb or baking soda is one. What are some of the other ones?
Yep, we'll go kind of in reverse order. Beta-alanine is another very classically effective one. Similar idea with sodium bicarbonate. So it's going to, beta-alanine is going to come in, it's going to be converted and stored as what's called carnosine in the muscle. And carnosine is an intracellular buffer. So in other words, it's just going to delay the buildup of acid. So fatigue blocker, if you will. So very effective, very cheap, very safe, well studied. The top one though of all of them by far that has an incredibly strong safety profile. It is a simple form to get, has a important magnitude of effect, and is effective across multiple domains of physical health and performance. And it is, because of that, it is my crown jewel. It is, in my opinion, without question, the Michael Jordan of all supplementation. And that's creatine monohydrate. It affects so many things. We typically think about it as it's muscle stuff, right? You quickly were talking about the creatine phosphate system. But we have to realize the vast majority of research on creatine phosphate is not in sport performance and has not been for 20 years. It's in clinical. And it has everything from effects on the neurological system to there have been associations to mental health and depression. And to be very clear, I am certainly not saying you can take creatine and cure anything. And I'm not saying it's going to stop you from depression or anything, but I'm saying there's a lot of research in these areas, and there's a reason people are doing it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And if you're willing, I'd love to have you back for us to do a discussion on creatine and the brain or creatine and the nervous system.
Yeah.
That would be a lot of fun. And maybe we can do a kind of a journal club in advance of that. For those that don't know, a journal club is where scientists read a bunch of papers and then argue about them, discuss them, and try and extract the kind of agreed upon center of mass, if you will. I think I've long been taking 5 grams of creatine monohydrate per day mainly for the cognitive effects.
Yep.
I sense an effect. That's obviously anecdata, but I think there are a lot of data out there as you
there's enough. You're not crazy. There's enough there, and in fact, there's enough mechanism now to understand the metabolic needs. Mm-hmm. People think I'm a muscle guy, right? So I'm going to think about the metabolism needed to fuel muscle, but we forget cells. Immune cells, red blood cells, nerve cells, astrocytes, brain, all this stuff requires energy. And it's all going through metabolism.
Super interesting. We will do the deep dive on that soon. I have a final question for you. you're involved in a really interesting, I think, really cutting edge project that I first learned about from you. I don't know of anyone else doing anything as forward thinking and frankly as relevant to the general population because of my interest in people getting better sleep and learning how to do that, avoiding stress and learning how to do that. Tell us a little bit about what I believe is called absolute rest.
Right. So this is something that we've been playing with behind the scenes for a long time. And this is typically how high performance stuff works, right? People want exclusivity, and so this has been built. Effectively, what happened is a friend of mine, Cody Burkhart, I don't know if you know Cody, but a famous
down in Texas.
Yeah, NASA
guy. Yeah, I do know Cody.
Wonderful, just down the road thinker. Everyone's interested in sleep, right? And for forever, I would say, God, we're using it with athletes, but everything available tells you how you're sleeping. Nothing can tell you why you're sleeping that way. And so we got together in Boulder, and then I met some of his former colleagues, computer science folks, Harvard MD, and some really impressive tech folks. And we were just thinking about an idea, and we came up with, and we started to realize the problems, right? We use first principle thinking. It's one of my favorite approaches. If you're not familiar with that, go Google that. Like, that's just a recipe to solve problems, this first principle thinking. And we just started to think about, like, man, all the sleep tech is there. It's real. I don't need to convince people that they need sleep. Everyone's done that. You need high quality sleep, but how can I provide solutions? And with the people I work with, I can't just tell them your testosterone's down or your sleep's down or recover. I need to be able to be like, this is down and here's why, and here's our solution. That's how our high performance world works. So enter absolute rest. This is saying, okay, what are the actual nodes that go into high effective, high quality sleep? Number one is psychology. So there has to be some sort of screening diagnostic for, are you not sleeping because of simply you can't control yourself? And you've done a wonderful job of giving people tools. Or if you can't quiet your mind before sleep, do this. If you wake up and you can't go back to sleep, here are a bunch of things, right? So we have some screens that we can do, and there's some other stuff we can do to analyze. This is a psychological issue. Let's say it's not. Right? You're under control, and we have different tricks we use and stuff which I'm happy to talk about. But it's not that. Okay, is it physiology, which is node number 2? Do we know what your dopamine levels are like? Do we know what your serotonin levels are like? What's melatonin look like? What's adrenaline? What's cortisol? Cortisol being the primary driver. What is this relationship DHEA? Where are these things at? So we're going to measure all that and track that. We're going to measure that during the day, prior to sleep. We're going to measure that next morning and even sometimes throughout sleep. And we're going to figure out, is this a physiology problem? If it is, then we have clear corrections. If not, we're going to go on to the next step, which is this possibly a pathology? So you have some sort of sleep disorder. We're going to run full what's called PSG, so polysomnography, the exact same stuff you would get in a sleep clinic. It's a sensor that's going to go on measuring EEG and EOG, and we're going to have muscle activation sensors to see if your legs are moving and everything else is going on. And we're going to get a full diagnostic. And if anyone's ever done this, the amount of sleep issues that are happening in people that they don't even realize is extraordinarily high. So we're going to figure this out. One very quick example, we just did this with a professional athlete, and he was having like 280 roughly of these episodes per night. And to be categorized as an episode, you have to meet these 4 specific criteria: oxygen saturation, ventilation changes, brain changes, etc. And he hit that over 280 times a night. And what this technology allowed us to do is figure out what position did all these things occur in. Well, in his particular case, most of them are happening was on his back. And so we bought a very simple like pillow, basically, that went on his back that kept him from sleeping on his back. And we saw an 85% reduction in sleep awakeness issues the very first night. Now, we did that. Testosterone eventually tripled after 3 months by just improving sleep. And all we did is move him onto his left or right side. So huge improvements just by understanding where the problem occurred and why it occurred there. We didn't have to change hardly anything else. He had the basic hygiene stuff down and temperature and all that stuff. And he had his chili pad and all that to keep the thing cool. We couldn't fix it. Years, by the way. This took us 2 years of just trying everything. We're like, man. And it was just like, I wish we could get you to sleep better. And I pulled out every trick I knew. And it's just, as soon as we built this dinner, I'm like, oh my God, he's not overweight, by the way. He's not iron deficient. He doesn't have any of these other classical symptoms that are associated with bad sleep. Supplementation, everything we've done, 1,000 protocols. That fixed it overnight. So if it's not psychology and it's not physiology and it's not pathology, then the last one that people don't have any idea about is environment. And so what you don't realize is we have a box. We can sit right next to your bed. You just plug it in. You don't have to do anything. And it's going to run full environmental scans. So it's going to look at the temperature in your room. It's going to look at the humidity in your room. It's going to look at the volatile organic acids. So these are things that are seeping out from your mattress. It's going to look at particulates in the air and possible allergens and things that are floating around that are closing your nose off so you can't sleep at night, and now your mouth breathing. And you've talked a lot, I'm sure, on the previous episodes about why that's bad. It's going to look at your CO2 cloud. So we've talked, we've already set this point up, right? You're inhaling O2, but then you're exhaling CO2. Well, during the day and when we're conversing, you have quite a bit of force with that exhalation, right? But at night, it's just barely seeping out of your mouth. So what happens is CO2 tends to cloud up and build around your face, and then you end up rebreathing that CO2. And this can cause a large number of sleep problems because you're simply rebreathing in the panic. Whether you fully awake or just kick out of a sleep stage, the CO2 around your face is a big issue. This stuff has all been known, by the way, with the astronauts for a very long time. It hasn't translated into the commercial space. It's, of course, gone into our high performer space. So we can measure that as well. And then we can figure out, like for the most extreme, we can actually come into a bedroom and build an entire sleep optimization setup and control the entire thing. But for most folks, the minimum we can do is run full diagnostics and check off, is this environmental related? Is it pathology? Is there something else?
So is this a commercial device that people can eventually access?
It is now.
So where can people learn more about Absolute Rest?
AbsoluteRest.com.
Very cool. And just for full disclosure, I wasn't aware that you had done this prior to today. What you mentioned, I always like to ask people, scientists or otherwise, I always love to ask, what are you most excited about lately? Yeah. And this sounds like an amazing technology.
And just to be really clear, that's not like something we're working on. That's landed.
Landed.
We're ready to go.
Great. Well, and that's one of the things I appreciate about you is that you're willing to sometimes speculate, but you always say it's speculation. But in general, you seem like the kind of guy where if you're going to be public facing about something, if you're going to make a statement, there's got to be quite a bit behind it. You're not going to allude to in 10 years, we might be able to do this, or in 5 years. You're a very data-driven kind of guy. Yeah.
Well, the people I work with, we need answers, right? We don't have that time frame, and we typically have hey, we start the season in 4 weeks.
Yeah.
So that's just where I'm at.
Well, as I said, I appreciate that about you, but it is but one of the many things I appreciate. I think the listeners and I can well appreciate on the basis of today's discussion what a enormous wealth of information you are, how clear and potently you communicate that information, and also how you can take a huge cloud of information and still distill it into protocols that ought to work for 75% of people, 75% of the time, which is an immensely valuable thing to do. So for me and from the listeners, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the several now hours. I lose track of time, which is reflects all good things. Several hours to take a break from teaching, take a break from research, take a break from the other important commitments of your life, and really share with us all this incredible information. I'm so grateful.
My pleasure, man. I'm glad we finally got to connect. This has been a long time in the making.
It has, and I'm going to bring the breathing protocols to my training. I'm going to start doing more of the endurance type and interval type training. I'm going to start moving when I do heat. I'm going to start moving when I do cold. I might even start throwing some sodium bicarb into very small amount of sodium bicarb into some water before I train. And listen, Andy, Professor Andy Galpin, thank you ever so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining me today for my discussion with Dr. Andy Galpin. If you'd like to learn more about his work and learn further information about exercise science from Dr. Galpin, please find him on Instagram at Dr. Andy Galpin. You can also find him on Twitter at the same handle, Dr. Andy Galpin, spelled with one L. And if you're learning from and or enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's a terrific zero-cost way to support us. Please also subscribe to the podcast on Spotify and Apple. And on Apple, you have the opportunity to leave us up to a 5-star review. If you have questions or comments about the podcast, or you have suggestions about future topics or guests that you'd like to see me interview, please put that in the comment section on YouTube. We do read all the comments. In addition, please check out the sponsors mentioned at the beginning of today's podcast. That's the best way to support this podcast. We also have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/Andrew Huberman. And there you can support the podcast at any level that you like. During today's conversation and on many previous episodes of the Huberman Lab podcast, we discuss supplements. While supplements aren't necessary for everybody, many people derive tremendous benefit from them for things like sleep and focus and energy and many other features of our physiology and mental functioning. There are some important issues to consider when considering supplements. One of those issues is the quality of the ingredients. For that reason, we've partnered with Thorne, Thorne, because Thorne supplements have the highest possible standards with respect to the quality of the ingredients they include. If you'd like to see the supplements that I take, you can go to Thorne, that's Thorne.com/U/Huberman, and there you'll see the supplements that I take, and you can get 20% off any of those supplements. If you navigate further into the Thorne site through that website, thorne.com/U/Huberman, you can also get 20% off any of the other supplements that Thorne makes. If you're not already following Huberman Lab on Instagram and Twitter, please do so. There I discuss science and science-based tools, some of which overlap with the content of the Huberman Lab podcast, but much of which is distinct from the information covered on this podcast. Thank you once again for joining me for my discussion with Dr. Andy Galpin. And as always, thank you for your interest in science.
That was a very fun tangent. But nonetheless, another couple of ones you can do are grip strength testing. So if you can buy a fairly cheap hand grip dynamometer on any number of places, these are typically able to be purchased for $20 to $40 or something like that, right? You can actually just test that every day. I've done that in a number of athletes for a decent amount of time. Admittedly, I don't do it anymore. And that's not because I disagree with it, but because we're getting the information already, and it was just too redundant. But if that's the only option, it is a great one to do. I mentioned also earlier how I actually like speed tests over strength tests as an earlier indication of overreaching. And so because of that, I like a vertical jump test. If you have access to a force plate, that's great. And then you can get more in-depth characteristics of the force velocity curve and acceleration and things like that. Used a lot in high performance situations. If not, simply looking at, your performance. And so you can kind of go back to one of our earlier episodes when I described coloring my fingertips with highlighters earlier in my life. You could do the same thing and go out in your garage and every day jump up and touch that marker and see where you're at. So a system like that could be done. You can also use tools like force transducer and do a standard movement. I can say a vertical jump or a high pull or something like that, and measure the velocity and just compare that day to day of a standard load, right? So you do it every single time with the same load. Similar thing could be done with like a medicine ball throw. So you have the same ball, you throw the same thing, and just sort of where you're at today. You want to do a little bit of warm up, but not excessive here. You want to kind of get an idea of where your baseline is, and you don't want to influence it by the veracity of the warm up every single day, because that alone can change it. Same thing with stretching. Acute static stretching directly influences power production. So you don't want to go out there and one day do a 20-minute stretch before, and then the other day you didn't stretch at all, because that alone will cause deviations in your performance. So try to keep everything you can think of standardized, and that'll give you a little bit better data. Remembering all of these values, the biomarkers, the performance stuff, they have normal variations. You just want to figure out first and foremost what those normal variations are for you. So you have your normal number, you have your standard deviation. When you start getting outside of that standard deviation, you start paying attention. And so that's kind of like what we typically call that the gray zone. And so if it's in the gray zone, we're fine, we're not adjusting. But if it's outside of that, whatever that is for you, recognizing that the gray zone is smaller for some folks and larger for others, but what is normal for you and your situation, and then you can make your decisions outside of that when you see numbers that are consistently or more than 3 to 5 days in a row or close, for the last 5 days, for the last 6, something like that. Then you maybe have some cause for action.
Well, that was an incredible description of the various tools and modes for recovery. And I realized I jumped the gun a bit during our discussion about food and supplements, but I like to think that it serves as a nice precursor to the next episode, which is going to be all about nutrition and supplementation. If you're learning from and/or enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's a terrific zero-cost way to support us. In addition, Please subscribe to the podcast on Spotify and Apple. And on both Spotify and Apple, you can leave us up to a 5-star review. If you have questions for us or comments or suggestions about topics you'd like us to cover or guests you'd like me to include on the Huberman Lab podcast, please put those in the comments section on YouTube. We do read all the comments. Please also check out the sponsors mentioned at the beginning and during today's episode. That's the best way to support this podcast. I'd also like to inform you about the Huberman Lab podcast free newsletter. It's called the Neural Network Newsletter, and each month, the Neural Network Newsletter is sent out, and it contains summaries of podcast episodes, specific protocols discussed on the Huberman Lab podcast, all in fairly concise format, and all completely zero cost. You can sign up for the Neural Network Newsletter by going to hubermanlab.com, go to the menu, and click on Newsletter. You provide us your email. We do not share it with anybody, and as I mentioned before, it's completely zero cost. By going to hubermanlab.com, you can also go into the menu tab and go to Newsletter and see some example newsletters from months past. Thank you once again for joining me for today's discussion about fitness, exercise, and performance with Dr. Andy Galpin. And as always, thank you for your interest in